Imagine it's 15th of November 1923. You are a 42-year-old schoolteacher living in Berlin, Germany. Your apartment is small but respectable, with coal in the stove, a clock above the table, and a locked drawer where you keep the savings from 15 careful years. Each morning you walk to class in a dark coat, buy bread on the way home, and tell yourself that patience and thrift are how decent people stay safe. Your salary still arrives, your bank book still has numbers in it, and your students still recite their lessons. So part of you wants to believe the world is holding together. But prices now change between breakfast and supper. Yesterday's money already feels like autumn leaves blowing down the street. If you have ever wondered why some people come out of inflation wounded while a smaller group somehow comes through standing, stay with me. What you are about to hear is not a theory. It is a pattern. It has happened in different places, under different flags, in different generations. And if this kind of historical clarity helps you see the world more clearly, subscribing takes 2 seconds and keeps you ahead of what most people only understand after the damage is done. By this morning, $1 is worth about 4.2 trillion paper marks. The savings in your drawer are not really savings anymore. They are stage props from a play that ended without warning. In shops across Berlin, clerks rewrite price tags so fast the chalk barely dries. Pensioners who did everything right are ruined. Farmers refuse to trade eggs and potatoes for paper that melts before they get home. Families rush wages from hand to hand as if money were not money at all, but ice carried across hot iron. And that is where this story begins. This video is about 5 kinds of assets that history keeps pushing to the survivor's side when inflation becomes a thief in broad daylight. Gold, real estate, farmland and commodities, shares in productive businesses, and hard foreign currency. Not because they are magic, not because they always rise in a straight line, but because when money itself is shrinking, the winners usually own claims on things that cannot be printed, or cash flows that can move when prices move, or value that sits outside the local currency trap. Before we go further, there is something important to understand. Inflation is not just prices going up. That is the smoke. The fire is that the measuring stick itself is warping. When a government prints too much money, or borrows too much and leans on the central bank, or locks itself into promises it cannot keep, the currency starts doing less work. The bills look the same. The numbers in the account may even grow. But each unit buys less bread, less rent, less fuel, less time. It is like trying to build a house with a ruler that shrinks every week. You can keep measuring, you can keep writing numbers down, but the numbers stop telling the truth. That is why inflation punishes some assets and protects others. Cash is a sitting duck because it is only a promise written in the same unit that is losing value. A bond with a fixed payment can suffer for the same reason. Its future money is locked in place while the world around it moves. But some assets behave differently. Gold is scarce and nobody can print it with a keystroke. A house can rise in price because the land is still there and the replacement cost of bricks, wood, copper, and labor rises with inflation. Farmland does something even better. It is not just land. It produces food, and food is one of the first places inflation shows its teeth. A productive business can sometimes lift its prices, protect its margins, and turn inflation from a threat into a rough kind of tailwind. And hard foreign currency can become a lifeboat when trust in the local money breaks apart. That is the secret key to this whole subject. Assets beat inflation when they are tied to reality more tightly than the currency is. Reality is grain, houses, metal, oil, rents, earnings, export income. Currency is the ticket people use to claim those things. When too many tickets get printed, the seats do not multiply. This brings us directly to the first part of the story. Gold has been called a barbarous relic, an old metal, a useless rock. Then history lights a match under paper money, and suddenly that old metal starts looking like a fire escape. In Weimar Germany, cash savers were not simply inconvenienced, they were erased. Britannica notes that before the First World War, the exchange rate had been just over 4 marks to the dollar. By November 1923, it had collapsed so far that $1 was worth around 1 trillion marks, and many accounts put the final panic rate at more than 4 trillion. Million-mark notes became billion-mark notes. Then, even those became absurd. One student recalled ordering a cup of coffee for 5,000 marks, and then another for 7,000 marks a few minutes later. That sounds unreal until you understand what hyperinflation means. It means prices rising so fast that people stop thinking in money and start thinking in speed. How fast can I spend this before it shrinks again? Who did best in that storm? Not the people with passbooks, not widows living on fixed pensions, not civil servants paid on schedules built for normal times. The people who suffered least tended to hold things with value outside the paper mark. Gold, foreign currency, hard goods, real property. There was a cruel counterintuitive twist here. Debtors often gained while creditors lost. If you owed money on real property and repaid in collapsing marks, the debt could turn to dust while the property stayed real. Inflation did not just raise prices, it quietly moved wealth across the table. It took from those holding claims in paper and handed relief to those holding claims on things. And this pattern did not die in 1923. It reappeared in Zimbabwe in 2008 with different faces and the same bones underneath. Reuters reported that Zimbabwe's annual inflation reached 231 million% in July 2008. Bread that cost $500 when the currency was redenominated on August 1st was soon selling for at least $7,000. Prices were jumping by 2,600% in a single month. Millions of Zimbabweans, according to the World Food Program statement cited by Reuters, were surviving on one meal a day. Barter came back. Relatives abroad became lifelines. Morgan Tsvangirai argued with Robert Mugabe over political power, while ordinary families argued over which purchase to make first before prices moved again. In that kind of world, gold does not need to be perfect. It only needs to hold still better than paper. The same was true of dollars, rand, cattle, and anything else that could store value for more than a few days. Gold matters in these stories, not because everyone owns a vault. Most do not. Gold matters because it reveals the rule. When trust burns, people run toward scarcity. A yellow coin, a silver bracelet, a dollar bill, a sack of maize, a small plot of land. The form changes. The instinct does not. It is the instinct to step off the melting floor. Here's something I want you to think about before we go further. If your paycheck kept arriving in full, but what it could buy was cut in half over and over again, would you feel richer because the number stayed large, or poorer because your life stayed real? Drop your answer in the comments. Seriously. Because what I am about to show you next is the part of this story that most people never hear. And it changes everything. Gold is dramatic, so it gets the headlines. But the ordinary asset that quietly saved millions during inflation was often not a coin in a safe. It was a roof. In the United States, the Great Inflation lasted from 1965 to 1982. And the Federal Reserve's own history says consumer inflation peaked close to 15% in March 1980. If you look at the annual average CPIU, the index rose from 38.8 in 1970 to 82.4 in 1980. In plain English, the cost of living more than doubled in one decade. That sounds like a statistic. It felt like a squeeze. Gas lines, angry wage fights, families watching grocery bills climb faster than salaries, public confidence draining away year after year like air from a tire with a slow leak. But now look at housing. U.S. Census data show the median price of a new home rose from $23,400 in 1970 to $64,600 in 1980. The average sales price rose from $26,600 to $76,400. That means home prices did not just keep up. In nominal terms, they ran far ahead. And there was another hidden engine under that rise: debt. A family that borrowed at a fixed rate early in the decade locked in payments measured in old dollars. Then inflation came through like a tide. Their mortgage payments stayed fixed, but wages and house prices moved higher. The debt did not disappear. But in real terms, meaning after inflation, it became lighter to carry. It was like owing 10 buckets of water and then finding out each bucket had a hole in the bottom. The lender received dollars. The borrower kept the house. Of course, this did not help everyone. Renters were squeezed. People trying to buy late in the decade faced soaring prices and then brutal interest rates. The 30-year mortgage rate would eventually spike above 18% in 1981. Broad stock indexes also struggled in real terms for stretches of the 1970s. Inflation is not kind to everything just because it is not cash. But a real house on real land, especially with long fixed debt, turned out to be a much stronger shield than a pile of savings in a bank account. And housing did not rise alone. The same decade gave us one of the most famous inflation winners in modern financial history. Gold had been fixed at $35 an ounce under Bretton Woods. By January 1980, it briefly traded above $800. That is the kind of move that makes headlines, but the deeper lesson is quieter. Inflation is not one disaster. It is several disasters unfolding at once. It attacks wages. It attacks savings. It attacks trust. Housing defended one side of family life because it preserved shelter and, in many cases, shrank the real weight of debt. Gold defended another side because it stood outside the policy machine. One asset was a fortress. The other was an escape hatch. This leads to the second part of the story. If real estate is a wall against inflation, farmland is a wall that grows wheat. It does not just sit there. It produces something the world must keep buying. During the same broad inflation era in the United States, the U.S. Department of Agriculture says real farmland prices increased 92% from 1969 to 1981. Read that again. Real, not just nominal. After adjusting for inflation, farmland nearly doubled. That happened because high agricultural returns and government policies encouraged investment, but also because farmland sits close to the source of necessity. When the currency wobbles, people may postpone a new car. They do not postpone eating. Food is where inflation stops being an abstract debate and becomes a dinner table emergency. Now carry that logic to Argentina. In December 2001, after years of strain, the government imposed the partial deposit freeze people came to know as the Corralito. Reuters later summarized the memory with brutal clarity. Deposits totaling about $40 billion were frozen. Riots broke out, ATMs were vandalized, supermarkets were looted. Millions of middle-class Argentines were thrown into poverty. The IMF records that Argentina abandoned its one-to-one convertibility regime in January 2002, and the peso fell from about 1 per dollar at the end of 2001 to 3.32 per dollar by the end of 2002. Think about what that meant in ordinary life. If your savings were trapped in the banking system and then converted into weaker pesos, you did not just lose convenience. You lost command over your own past labor. Years of effort were suddenly filtered through politics, emergency law, and exchange rates you did not choose. But Argentines had lived through earlier inflation before. The Federal Reserve noted that Argentina became heavily dollarized during the hyperinflations of 1989 and 1990. People used dollars not just for savings, but for big transactions and as a parallel store of value because the local currency had already broken trust. That habit mattered. The people who held dollars outside the peso trap, or who owned land tied to export earnings, or who controlled productive assets that repriced with the devaluation, were not untouched. But they were standing on higher ground. Farmland in particular had a brutal advantage in a country like Argentina. It was linked directly or indirectly to globally priced crops and to export income that could be measured in dollars, while many domestic wages and savings were trapped in pesos. A wheat field or soy field does not read central bank speeches. It responds to rain, global demand, and the price somebody will pay for grain. That is why productive land so often looks dull in calm years and brilliant in broken ones. It is a battery connected to basic human need. Now look at what happened next. After the deposit freeze and devaluation, trust in banks did not simply bounce back. Reuters quoted a 70-year-old Argentine woman named Stella in 2019 saying, "I prefer to have my savings at home. It's my insurance for the next few years." That sentence tells you more about inflation than 100 textbooks. When people stop trusting the pipe, they store water in buckets. When they stop trusting the bank, they store value in whatever feels harder to seize, harder to dilute, and easier to understand. Sometimes that means dollars in a drawer. Sometimes it means land. Sometimes it means a business with inventory on the shelf. Most people will never know what you now know. Most people will keep trusting systems they do not understand. If you are still here, you are not most people. Hit subscribe. Because the next section is the part this channel was made for, the part they never put in textbooks. Now look at all three together. Weimar Germany in 1923, the United States in the 1970s, Argentina in 2001 and 2002. Different countries, different decades, different political stories. Same result, the same mechanism, different countries, different decades, same result. In each case, paper claims were the first layer to crack. Savings accounts, fixed pensions, wages set too slowly, bonds with payments locked in money that was losing force. And in each case, value flowed toward assets tied more closely to real life. Gold, housing, productive land. Dollars, businesses able to reprice. Inflation is often described as if it were a rising tide that lifts all nominal numbers together. That is too simple. Inflation is more like acid rain falling on a city of different roofs. Some materials corrode fast, some hold up, some leak slowly enough that the family underneath has time to move. The important thing is not whether an asset's price rises. Many prices rise. The important thing is whether the asset preserves purchasing power after the currency has done its damage. That is why a checking account can look stable and still make you poor. That is why a fixed bond can feel safe and still lose ground. That is why a mediocre apartment, a plain farm, or a boring old metal can suddenly become the place where wealth hides when the storm begins. And here is the counterintuitive part most people miss. Broad stock markets do not automatically save you in every inflation shock. Some do badly for long stretches in real terms. What matters is ownership of businesses with pricing power, meaning the ability to raise prices without losing all their customers, or ownership of companies sitting on hard assets like oil reserves, pipelines, mines, farmland, timber, or essential brands. In inflation, the difference between a productive business and a paper promise becomes enormous. One can adjust. The other waits to be paid in weaker money. At this point, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. The assets that endure are the ones attached to scarcity, necessity, or flexibility. Scarcity means they cannot be printed. Necessity means people must keep paying for what they produce. Flexibility means the cash flow can reset as prices reset. Everything else is trying to outrun a fire in slippers. And this is where history gets uncomfortable. Inflation does not strike society evenly. It is not a general pain shared in fair proportion. It is a transfer machine. It hits the careful, the slow, and the locally trapped first. The middle-class saver with cash in the bank, the pensioner on a fixed income, the wage earner whose pay is revised once a year while food rises every month, the shop owner whose costs jump before customers can absorb new prices, the family that did exactly what the old rules said to do and then discovers the rules were written for a world that no longer exists. Look at Lebanon after 2019. Reuters reported that by early 2023, the official exchange rate had been devalued by 90%, from 7.5 pounds per dollar to 15,000, while the parallel market rate was around 60,000. The same Reuters report said depositors had been largely unable to withdraw hard currency since 2019 and were forced, in many cases, to take losses in local pounds. In the absence of reform, a $70 billion hole in the financial system hung over the country like a sinkhole under a crowded street. The World Bank data reported through the Associated Press showed poverty rising from 12% in 2012 to 44% in 2022. Many Lebanese discovered that the savings of a lifetime were not gone in one dramatic confiscation. They were eaten in thin slices by exchange rates, withdrawal rules, inflation, and delay. That is how inflation often works in real life. Not as a single explosion, but as termites in the beams. The house still stands for a while. Then, one day, the floor gives way. Who did better in Lebanon? Not everyone with dollars won, not everyone with property escaped, but households with access to hard currency, families with assets abroad, businesses earning in dollars, and owners of real assets linked. To import prices or rents had a very different experience from salary earners and depositors stuck inside the banking trap. The same divide appeared in Zimbabwe. It appeared in Argentina. It appeared in Weimar Germany. When local money stops functioning as a trustworthy store of value, society starts splitting into two realities. One group still lives inside the failing unit. The other group has at least one foot outside it. This is also where productive businesses enter the picture. A bakery can still suffer when flour and fuel explode in cost. Many small firms are crushed, but a larger business with inventory, strong demand, export income, or the power to reset prices fast has a chance that a fixed income household does not. In every inflation episode, you see some version of the same scene. Workers chase prices, savers chase exchange rates, governments chase credibility, and owners of scarce, necessary, or adaptable assets move with the storm rather than standing still in it. This leads to the fourth and fifth assets on our list, and they are less romantic than gold or farmland, but often just as important. The fourth is ownership in productive businesses. The fifth is hard foreign currency. Both matter for the same reason. They can move when fixed claims cannot. Look at Brazil at the end of the 1980s. A major study on Brazil's inflation history notes that the decade ended with inflation running at about 70% a month, and that before the real plan in 1994, inflation was near 90% a month. Monthly, not yearly, monthly. In that world, every delay became a penalty. A family that waited to shop watched its money shrink by the week. A worker whose wages were adjusted on the wrong date could be poorer than a co-worker with the same salary simply because prices had already run ahead. Brazil even built daily life around indexation, which means prices and contracts being adjusted over and over to keep pace with past inflation. For a time, prices were quoted in a parallel unit called the URV before the new real arrived in July 1994. That sounds technical, but the meaning is simple. People were trying to anchor value outside the sliding currency because the old unit had stopped telling the truth. And here is where the business asset becomes clear. A productive company is not a promise to pay one fixed number in the future. It is a moving machine. It has inventory. It has customers. It may have export income. It may own land, trucks, warehouses, or equipment. It may be able to raise prices this week, not next year. That does not make every business safe. Many are destroyed by inflation. Small firms with weak margins can be crushed between rising costs and angry customers. But ownership in businesses with pricing power, hard assets, or foreign revenue is historically very different from owning a fixed bond or holding idle cash. One can react, the other just absorbs the blow. In inflation, speed becomes part of value. The butcher who reprices today is in a stronger position than the pension fund waiting for a quarterly statement. The exporter earning dollars is in a stronger position than the clerk paid in local notes. The oil producer, miner, grain trader, pipeline owner, and utility with real assets under it are not living in the same weather as the family whose savings sit in a fixed account. Brazil produced one of the strangest examples of this logic. In the 1980s, as one business history paper notes, even telephone lines from the state company Telebrás were bought and sold on a parallel market as if they were property. Think about how bizarre that is. A telephone line became a store of value, not because telephone wires were magical, but because people were so desperate to step out of melting cash that they reached for any scarce claim that might hold value better than currency. That is inflation at full psychological depth. It does not just change prices. It changes what people think wealth is. Now turn to hard foreign currency. This is the least glamorous asset in the video, but again and again, it shows up in the hands of those who take less damage. In Argentina, Reuters reported that after the shock of the 2019 primary election, dollar deposits fell by $1.9 billion in a week, about 6% of the total, as savers moved to grab cash while they could. Why? Because the memory of 2001 had never left. Because people remembered what it felt like when bank doors stayed open but access to money did not. Because they knew the difference between a balance on a screen and notes you could actually move. In Lebanon, the same brutal lesson returned. Depositors often had dollar accounts on paper but could not freely withdraw hard currency. The distinction sounds minor until a crisis hits. Then it becomes the entire game. A paper dollar trapped in a failing system is not the same as a physical dollar or an accessible dollar abroad. One is a claim on a promise. The other is spendable escape. This is why foreign currency appears so often in inflation history. It is not because people suddenly become patriotic about another country's money. It is because they are trying to buy back optionality. Optionality is room to act, room to leave, room to wait, room to buy essentials before tomorrow's price jump. During Zimbabwe's collapse, people relied on relatives abroad and on foreign notes because local money was disintegrating too fast. During Argentina's crisis, dollars under mattresses carried emotional weight because they represented independence from policy error. During Lebanon's meltdown, families with access to hard currency did not become rich by magic. They simply remained attached to a measuring stick that had not shattered locally. Hard currency is not a heroic asset. It is more like a spare oxygen tank. You hope not to need it. History shows why people reach for it anyway. Before we go further, notice how cruel the timing is. Inflation does not usually announce itself with a trumpet. It whispers first. A few bad prints, a temporary spike, a promise that this is under control. By the time people feel the full weight of it, the easy exits are crowded. Housing is already expensive. Gold is already up. Dollars are harder to get. Capital controls, which means rules that limit moving money out of the system, start appearing. The bridge does not collapse all at once. It buckles one cable at a time. The historical record shows that those who came through these periods in better shape largely shared three characteristics. First, they owned some claim on something real: a house, a farm, gold, inventory, shares in a productive business. They did not rely only on a number printed on paper by somebody else. Second, they had some form of income or value that could reset. Rent could rise, crop prices could rise, export earnings could rise, business revenue could be repriced, a fixed pension could not. Third, they were not trapped entirely inside one institution, one bank, one currency, or one political promise. They had optionality, which is just a complicated word for room to move when conditions change. The question is not whether this pattern will repeat. History has already answered that. The only question is whether you will see it before it sees you. If this channel helps you think differently about the world you live in, subscribe. It costs nothing, and it might change everything. Notice what is missing from that list: perfect foresight. Nobody in these stories had it. The winners were not all geniuses. Many were simply positioned, by habit or by luck, on the right side of the inflation line. The Argentine family that kept some savings in dollars because grandparents remembered 1989. The American homeowner who fixed a mortgage before the late 1970s got ugly. The landowner whose acreage rose with food prices. The business owner who could lift prices faster than costs. The Lebanese family with a son abroad sending hard currency home. Hitcheries does not show one magical asset. It shows a family resemblance among the assets that endure. They are hard to print, close to necessity, or able to adjust. That is why the title of this video is both true and incomplete. These 5 assets beat inflation not in the sense of a guaranteed straight line, but in the far more important sense that across repeated inflation shocks, they gave people a better chance of preserving purchasing power than cash, fixed wages, or fixed claims. Gold protected scarcity, real estate protected shelter and sometimes diluted debt. Farmland and commodities protected necessity. Shares in productive businesses protected adaptability. Hard foreign currency protected optionality when local trust collapsed. Together, they form a map of how value tries to escape when paper is under pressure. And there is one more uncomfortable lesson. Survivors were often emotionally different before they were financially different. They did not confuse normalcy with safety. They understood that a bank statement is not wealth by itself. It is only a claim, and claims are strongest when the system behind them is strong. Once faith starts cracking, claims have to be tested against reality. Can I spend this? Can I move this? Can I reprice this? Can I store this? Can I sell this to someone who does not care what my government says it is worth? Those are old questions. They keep coming back because money is not just economics. It is memory. It is trust. It is social glue. When that glue weakens, people fall back on older forms of certainty. Metal, land, food, foreign notes, ownership in useful things. So return now to Berlin on 15th of November, 1923. You're still that school teacher. By the end of the crisis, the careful life you built with paper savings is gone. The drawer is full, but the value is absent. The clock still ticks. The coal still burns. But the bargain you thought existed between work, thrift, and security has been broken. Somewhere else in the same city, someone with a mortgage on real property has seen debt evaporate in real terms. Someone with foreign currency has crossed the storm with less damage. Someone holding gold has preserved far more of yesterday labor than the person holding marks. That is the lesson history keeps dragging back to the surface. Inflation is not just a rise in prices. It is a sorting machine. It sorts paper from reality. It sorts claims from control. It sorts the assets tied to scarcity, necessity, and adaptability from the assets that depend on stable money staying stable. This is historical and educational analysis. It is not financial advice. Every individual situation is different. Please consult a qualified professional before making any financial decision. This video is not for everyone. Most people will dismiss it. But if one person in your life needs to hear this, share it with them. Not because it will change the world, because it might change their world. Subscribe for more, and I will see you in the next one.